Welcome to this episode of Evidence of Greatness. For this episode, we are going to look at psychoeducation, and specifically, does psychoeducation help prevent post-traumatic psychological distress? And I'm going to take this information from an article written by these authors here, Wessely, Bryant, Greenberg, Earnshaw, Sharpley, and Hughes, and talk a little bit about what they discovered. Now, I want to preface and say this study is a little bit old. It was written in 2008, so there may be more current literature that will supplement this. But I think this article raises some really, really important points, and so wanted to give some justification for why I'm including it here. These authors begin by giving a definition of what psychoeducation is. And this definition of psychoeducation is important because what it does is it shows you kind of the range of what they're looking at. So they define it as a provision of information in a variety of media about the nature of stress, post-traumatic and other symptoms, and what to do about them. So this can be written material, this can be audio material, this could be visual material, any kind of information. And again, they specifically are looking at the impact on trauma. Now, one of the things I want to talk about as well is that much of this study focused on trauma within a military setting, but also a little bit within civilian settings. In addition, they looked at psychoeducation preemptively. So if I give people information about possible trauma, about possible symptoms, does that have an impact on their traumatic response? And also post-traumatic experience. Now, they make a really clear distinction here. This is the third bullet point down, that they're not discussing psychoeducation for people who already have been diagnosed with PTSD. So this is pre or post exposure to trauma, but not the development of traumatic symptoms to a place where it's diagnosable. So in addition, they talk about psychoeducation as prevalent, and they list lots and lots of places where organizations such as the World Health Organization list psychoeducation as one of the tools that's important and necessary for helping to mitigate the impacts of trauma. But what they conclude kind of at the end of this literature review section is, despite the ubiquity, or it's widespread, it's almost everywhere, the impact of or the prevalence of psychoeducation, good evidence as to the value of psychoeducation is rare. So this is a really important thing that they are saying, is that psychoeducation seems to be just embedded into lots of psychotherapy, but there is very little research that shows that psychoeducation has value. And so we'll talk a little bit about how they determined this outcome. So they start with why people oftentimes advocate for psychoeducation. And it comes down to 5 general assumptions that people usually make about why psychoeducation is important. The first is, if people are given information about what symptoms they may experience after a trauma, they may find these experiences to be less distressing. So in essence, they're saying, let's arm people with information, and therefore they're going to be more equipped, better able to maneuver when they have a traumatic experience. The second assumption that people generally work from is that psychoeducation usually involves imparting some message. And the message is usually that for the majority of individuals, the symptoms that they experience are normal, in a sense that they're supposed to be expected and that many people get them. So the idea is, if we can provide people with this information, it will reassure them that their experience is a normal experience. The third assumption is that psychoeducation may assist people in seeking help. They'll know when they need to get help. So again, some people may not notice or recognize that the symptoms that they're experiencing are traumatic experiences or traumatic symptoms, and therefore they might not seek help otherwise. So knowing what those symptoms are would increase the likelihood of them seeking help. And in addition, psychoeducation helps them to know where to access that help. So the fourth assumption then is that it's possible that psychoeducation may introduce corrective information that modifies a trauma survivor's perception of the event. It might also modify their experience of themselves or modify their future expectations. So in some sense, this really comes from a cognitive behavioral perspective that it alters maladaptive appraisal, that when I experience a traumatic event, I misattribute or I misassess or I misappraise what that experience was or what it was like or what impact it will have. And therefore, psychoeducation can correct these maladaptive appraisals. And then the fifth assumption is that it encourages empowerment. It gives people information, and therefore they can act on their own behalf. They can be empowered to make choices for themselves. So those are kind of the assumptions for why psychoeducation might be useful. Now, then they say, so what's the actual evidence? What does the evidence about psychoeducation say? And again, keeping in mind that this is a bit old, but at the time, they could only find one direct study that looked specifically at psychoeducation. And this was from 2005, and it's what they called the Sheffield trial. And I should highlight that this study comes from the UK. So in the Sheffield trial, what they determined in that is that there was no evidence that psychoeducation helped after a trauma. It suggested that the people who were the most distressed were also those who were least likely to benefit from psychoeducation, and interestingly, were most likely to be harmed by it. So when they were the most distressed, then getting this additional information just seemed to exacerbate their level of distress. So not only was psychoeducation not really helpful, it might actually have induced harm. So that was the only study that could be found at the time that was looking at traumatic experiences and psychoeducation. Then they went on to say, let's look more broadly then. Let's look at indirect evidence. So the way that they kind of accessed this indirect evidence was usually they were looking at randomized controlled trials where psychoeducation was the treatment as usual or the control group mechanism. So one group, let's say, would get, in our case, solution-focused therapy, or another case, they might get cognitive behavioral therapy. That was what they called the experimental group. The control group, or the group that didn't really get the treatment, they got psychoeducation. And interestingly, across all of these studies that they looked at where there was these randomized controlled trials, there were some various findings, but none of them were actually that great. The various findings were the psychoeducation group resulted in relatively ineffective outcomes. It was regularly less effective than the treatment. So regardless of what treatment they got, psychoeducation came out less effective. It was the least effective of all of the interventions. So they looked at various studies, and in essence, time and time again, they said, this group or these groups came out worse. It wasn't very effective. It didn't help them. They didn't show any improvement. There were some studies that showed that psychoeducation, when it was part of a therapeutic approach, could lead to modest therapy gains. But what was tricky about that, so CBT oftentimes has a psychotherapy, a psychoeducation component to it, but it's really hard to detangle. Was it the psychoeducation that made the impact, or was it a different component of, let's say, cognitive behavioral therapy? So when it was part of a bigger model, then it showed that there was maybe some positive outcomes, but it was very difficult to say, was it specifically because of the psychoeducation? Then they looked at debriefing specifically. So after somebody experienced a traumatic event, then they would come back and they would get debriefed. And so they were looking at the impact of this debriefing as a way to look at perhaps making debriefing a kind of psychoeducation. And the Cochrane review, which looked at several studies, they concluded and said, at the present, the routine use of individual debriefing in the aftermath of individual trauma cannot be recommended either in military or civilian life. So in essence, they're saying it was ineffective and it was unhelpful, and we don't recommend debriefing. In addition, the authors of this study went on to say it's widely accepted that debriefing immediately after a trauma definitely does not work. And indeed, more than in one study showed that it significantly increased the risk of psychological distress. So this is things like where they had to go in and debrief the trauma that they experienced, and they had to talk through. And again, the purpose of this was to normalize, to say what you experienced was normal, what you experienced, although seemed really dangerous and threatening, here in this safe environment, you can debrief, you can kind of experience it again, but in a safe environment. And across the board, it was determined this kind of debriefing as a psychoeducation isn't helpful and in fact does more harm. I think that's a significant finding, and I think that kind of bolsters why we as solution-focused brief therapists might say, we don't need to debrief. We don't need to talk about the problem. We don't need you to go through all the details of how it happened and what happened and all of those things. And in fact, that doing that might do you more harm. So I think that's a really significant finding that has implications for us as solution-focused therapists. They went on then to look at stress inoculation training. This again was a specific kind of training. It was a CBT-based training where psychoeducation was a specific component. And there were several positive trials that resulted from this stress inoculation training. But what was important about this is that this kind of psychoeducation was about well-defined events, which would happen in the future. They would happen at a particular time, a predetermined time, and they would occur for a particular purpose. And so I could predict when this was going to happen. I understood why this was going to happen. I understood the benefits of this particularly traumatic event. Things like vaccinations, right? If I'm afraid of needles, I have to go get a vaccination. I then get psychoeducation or information about what it's going to be like, what the impacts might be. And that does show some specific benefits. So that is preemptive psychoeducation, and it is about something that's very predictable. So I want to be really clear, there are some studies that show that psychoeducation can be helpful, but usually it's for a particular experience. And then finally, they talked about bibliotherapy, and again, they talked about it as this, as getting a book or a video or an audio recording or something like that. And they showed that that could be effective for dealing with anxiety, not necessarily for preventing it, but showing that it could work. So there is a little bit of mixed bag here, but predominantly not much support for psychoeducation. So why might psychoeducation be ineffective? So they talked about if it doesn't show to be very, very effective across the board, why not? And they outlined 5 different reasons. One is that it might give people too much information. Research showed that when they were exposed to the possible symptoms, then they increased the possible symptoms. This is what they called the nocebo phenomenon, which is adverse side effects developed because they expected adverse side effects. So you could say, if you take this drug, a possible side effect is headaches. When you tell people that more often than just at random, do people experience headaches? So our expectation has a big part in what impact it has. Second, it sensitizes people to the potential hazard. And again, this is somewhat similar to it, but in essence, they say it's not just the symptoms, but it's the risk. When I am sensitized to the risk of the hazard, then my expectation of that risk goes up and it increases distress. Repeatedly labeling an event traumatic superimposes a set of attributions and expectations that might not otherwise occur. So simply calling something traumatic superimposes my attribution that this should be traumatic or this is going to be traumatic, and therefore I experience it as traumatic. Fourth, it says most ordinary people already have well-developed coping skills for dealing with adversity. Those involve accessing their own social support networks, and giving that social support is a powerful association for recovery from trauma. This is a very well-adapted response. I think this has huge implications for solution-focused therapy. It says most people already know what to do when they are in a distressing situation. And most commonly, it is to reach out to my support network, my friends, my family, my relatives, those kinds of people. And just by connecting with them, just by associating with them, just by sharing the burden with them, then the impact of the trauma decreases. Most ordinary people already know that. And they went on to cite lots of research where they said when something big and traumatic happened, they assessed the population and said, how many of you feel like you're going to go access mental health care from a therapist or a clinician? Very, very few people said that they were going to do that. And the impact didn't seem to be different between those who did and those who didn't go access mental health care. If they could connect with their support system, if they could use their own resources. So again, as solution-focused therapists, if we take this idea of most people know already what to do, how to access something that's going to be helpful to them, it might be useful for us to ask about that social support system. It might be useful for us to ask about what they already know or how they planned to deal with things. And they'll then be able to tell us and reiterate that to us and are therefore more likely to go access it. Instead of us providing them information, they teach themselves what's going to be useful and helpful. And then finally, they talk a lot about there's a general tendency in mental health sector to assume that people are less knowledgeable about emotional matters than is actually the case. So again, when we talk about psychoeducation, one of the implications is I need to give this information to people because they don't know it. But the reality is they do already know a lot of these things. And therefore, when we go over it, they feel like it's redundant. They don't feel like it's very helpful. They feel like they already know this information, that they're not really getting something useful from psychotherapy because they're just getting things that they already know. And so again, I think that's something really, really important is that we as solution-focused therapists look at our clients and we say, you have the resources, you have the knowledge, you have the capability. I just need to have a conversation about what outcome you're looking for. And this really takes away the need for psychoeducation. And then finally, they talk about what actually helps. So if psychoeducation doesn't really help that much, what does help? One, effective practical training. So if they have a particular job that they need to do, getting training in that job. So again, that's outside of our realm as clinicians. We can't give that to them. They need to go access that, reading books and information about what their job is or what their role is or something like that. That helps. Group cohesion, again, accessing their network, their social support system, and strong morale. Again, I would equate this back to hope. So we as solution-focused clinicians, we can do some things. We can talk about their resources. We can talk about their social support systems. We can talk about their resources. We can say, have conversations that are hope-filled. What are your best hopes? Those are things that actually help much more than psychoeducation. So I think there's some real implications for why we do what we do. Here is the final, if you want to access this article, here's how you can access it. Now, I want to just conclude by saying, again, this is one study, so please don't take it as like the definitive answer to is psychoeducation useful or not. It's one study, but it's one study that really outlines some really significant things. It also bolsters our support for why we as solution-focused therapists do what we do. We do this because we help them to access their support systems. We help them to increase their hope. We help them to be able to feel resilient by accessing information that they already know. And so I think many, many times we get asked, what if I just do solution-focused brief therapy with a little bit of psychoeducation? And one of the things I would say about that is there really isn't much support to show that psychoeducation is going to be that helpful. But it also might muddy the water about what's actually helping our clients. They might feel like I already know this information or I already have access to this, and therefore they might not really buy into the rest of what we do because their expectation is lowered. So I just want to point out that we have an important role to just stick to our job, to just do what solution-focused brief therapy says we should do. And that might in and of itself be really, really helpful to our clients. So let me know what you think. Hopefully this will help you to start to think about, is psychoeducation really that helpful? But I hope this was useful, and I would love to hear your thoughts about it.